I'm Elex Michaelson. This week, the issue is guns.
Those who own AR-15s will understand that surrendering those weapons is in the best interests of our fellow Americans.
One-on-one with presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke on his mandatory gun buyback plan. Plus, the issue is homelessness.
There are incredible barriers to building affordable housing in this area.
Housing Secretary Ben Carson on the Trump administration's plan for homeless encampments in California. That more with our panel, State Senator Holly Mitchell, the LA Times' Seema Mehta, and Breitbart's Joel Pollack. The issue is starts right now.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
Beto O'Rourke's comments about guns got the biggest applause of any at the recent Democratic debate, and 1 week later he traveled to California for a series of appearances. He was at San Quentin to talk about criminal justice reform. He visited a marijuana dispensary in Oakland. He talked about homelessness on Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, and he talked with us for an exclusive one-on-one interview about guns. So the big issue right now is guns, something that you've gotten so much attention for, this position to take away AR-15s, AK-47s. How do you actually do that? Is that a constitutional amendment? Is that an executive order? Is that a bill passed by Congress? How do you do it?
We do it. As a country, we decide that the lives of our fellow Americans, especially our kids, who far too often are hunted down in their classrooms, in the hallways of their schools, are the most important thing. And we're going to make sure that we protect your Second Amendment right to have a gun, to hunt, to protect yourself in your home, but that there is no right to own a weapon of war, an AR-15 or an AK-47 that was designed and engineered to kill people as effectively, as efficiently as possible on a battlefield. So I expect Americans to comply with the law. Those who own AR-15s will understand that surrendering those weapons is in the best interests of our fellow Americans and making sure that we address an epidemic of gun violence that takes more than 40,000 lives a year.
But is that a law that you pass? Is that something you just put out there? I mean, how do you actually get this done?
It's a law that would be passed by the American people through their representatives in Congress, a law which I would sign and a law which I would enforce. We've seen this happen in other countries. Australia had a mandatory buyback of AR-15s and AK-47s after a deadly mass shooting there. And it's estimated that 16 mass shootings have been prevented since that law has been adopted.
You know, the NRA, though, would say that this is illegal to do it. It's against the Constitution. They will likely sue over something like this. We've seen their lawsuits over and over again. How do you fight this in court, especially with the Supreme Court that has a lot of conservatives on it right now?
Yeah. If we are afraid of the NRA, if we allow our fear of the courts to keep us from moving, then we are complicit in the gun deaths and the violence that we've seen. Justice Scalia opined from the Supreme Court that the Second Amendment right is not an absolute one, that there are some common sense constraints like keeping weapons of war out of the hands of our fellow Americans. No one would argue that you should have a grenade launcher or be able to drive a tank down the street. This AR-15, and you can take it from the words of the man who designed it himself, was not intended for civilian use. The ability to kill people in record numbers, to impose a kind of suffering and harm that's hard for us to imagine unless we've experienced it, is not something that we should accept in this country, and I refuse to accept it.
El Paso, when that shooting happened, how did that change you as a man? How did that change you as a candidate?
El Paso showed me the real cost and consequence of Donald Trump. That, you know, a racism and a violence that had been alive and well in this country from the very beginning of this country was welcomed out into the open and directed at El Paso, Texas. I mean, this is the president who said Mexicans are rapists and criminals, who warned of invasions and infestations and killers and predators. And then when someone at one of his rallies in May said, shoot them, when referring to immigrants, the president smiled and laughed. He said this was okay to do. And a killer with an AK-47 drove 600 miles and came to El Paso, really directed that way by the president of the United States. It changed me because it told me that we can no longer keep quiet. We can no longer fail to call things for what they are. We can no longer meet this threat with anything less than the urgency that it deserves. And that's the way that I've been speaking. That's the way I've been bringing my fellow Americans into this. And that's the way that we're going to affect the change that we want to see.
Just to wrap things up, on our show last week, Bob Shrum, the political strategist, said that during the debates you were Beto Unchained. Our debate focus group said that you won over everybody else. They were most impressed by you. They weren't even thinking of voting for you, and now they are thinking of voting for you. Do you feel a sense of relief that you're sort of finally just doing things the way you want to do them? Is that a change for you?
My job's going to be to see things as clearly as I can, to speak as honestly as I can, and to be as decisive as possible about the solution. So on gun violence, it means being honest about the fact that universal background checks and red flag laws and an end to the sale of weapons of war are good steps, but are insufficient. And so we'll say the politically difficult but absolutely necessary thing that we need to buy those weapons back. On our drug laws, we'll talk about the changes that we need to make, including ending for-profit prisons and cash bail. We'll talk about a racism that infects every single part of American life, including our economy and healthcare and education, and how we need to address that by having every single American tell their story, by doing so telling the full American story. This is the kind of conversation we need to have as a country, the kind of conversation I'm grateful to be leading as a candidate for the presidency.
Beto O'Rourke, thank you so much
Thank
for the
you.
time.
Yeah,
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, great.
And we are playing Beto's favorite band, The Clash, for him. You can see him talk about marijuana reform right now at youtube.com/Elex Michaelson. Up next, we talk homelessness with the man in charge of the federal government's response, Secretary Ben Carson, when we come back.
The issue is,
if these Democrat liberal politicians don't straighten out, the federal government will have to come in. We're not going to lose cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and others.
That's President Trump during his visit to California this week. We spoke one-on-one with his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson. Secretary Carson, welcome back to The Issue Is. So homelessness, the most important issue to so many people in the state of California right now.
Yes.
One of the questions has been, what exactly is the Trump administration proposing? There's these reports that potentially police would break up some of these tent cities, send people into vacant government buildings. Is that true?
What is true is that we're looking at a whole slew of options. We would like to work with the city and the state. You know, it doesn't seem sometimes that they really want to work with us, but you know, the key thing is we've got people out there on the street, and it's not just because they're on the street, it's because they're creating very unsanitary conditions which can be the precursor to an epidemic.
So is this police option, is that an option? I mean, that is something you guys are considering, to essentially break up the tent cities?
Well, let's put it this way. I think it is important that we support and empower the police so that they feel that when there are people who are unruly and who are infringing on the rights of others, they feel that they have the ability to go in and do something about it.
The governor of California says one of the ways to solve the problem is he wants 50,000 vouchers for affordable housing for some of these folks on the street. What say you to that?
I would say, let's sit down. We're quite happy to provide some technical assistance to help them utilize the vouchers they already have. They're not utilizing those to the maximum extent. You know, rather than just throwing more and more money toward a problem, let's create efficiency with what we've already allocated.
Los Angeles County have passed big measures, spending a lot of money to deal with this issue. And yet the problem is getting worse. The homeless count up this past year.
Considerably up.
In your term too, in what you are doing in the federal government. What's going wrong? I mean, why is it getting worse?
Well, I think, you know, we're doing a lot of things that don't make sense. For instance, there are incredible barriers to building affordable housing in this area. And, you know, it's a matter of supply and demand. And if you can't build affordable housing, of course it's going to get worse every year. That's what we really need to be concentrating on.
I mean, that is one of the big questions, this NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. It'd be great to deal with homelessness as long as I'm not the one dealing with homelessness.
And I understand NIMBYism.
How do you deal with that?
Education. Because NIMBYism is based on misinformation. People think that the government still does things the way we did it in the 60s and the 70s with these gigantic multifamily constructs with little forethought, afterthought, or any kind of thought. We don't do that anymore. Now we're talking about public-private partnerships. We're talking about mixed income. We're talking about things that are architecturally consistent with the environment. Obviously, we're not talking about building a multifamily structure in the middle of a single block neighborhood. You know, there is actually some common sense here and there.
Speaking of that, sometimes there's some wild accusations said about the Trump administration. We don't get a chance to talk to the Trump administration all that often. What do you think is sort of the biggest misconception out there about the Trump administration and about you?
Well, I think, you know, this whole concept of everybody being a racist, I think is just totally childlike and absurd. And, you know, I think a lot of people think that, you know, I need this job, that this is something that I really wanted to do. I was extremely happy for the years that I was practicing medicine, and then I retired for a couple of years. Those were some of the best years of my life. And the only reason that I ran for president and the only reason I'm doing this is because I'm very concerned about what's happening with our country.
We do something on our show called Personal Issues, which is a little bit of fun. It's like 30 seconds of quick fire questions to just get to know you a little better.
Okay.
So here we go. You ready? What's your favorite book?
The Bible.
Favorite holiday?
Christmas.
Favorite nickname?
Ben.
Favorite meal?
Broccoli chiquette.
Favorite candy?
My wife.
His wife is named Candy, if you guys don't know. And you know, this is a big day, because it's your birthday today.
It is.
Well, happy birthday. Thank you for spending part of it with us.
Thank you very
Dr. Ben
much.
Carson, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
Happy birthday to Dr. Carson. He got to spend his birthday with his wife, Candy Carson. For her, we're playing Mandy Moore's Candy. A lot to go on there with our panelists. Of course, that's one of our favorite songs for our panelists. Joel Pollack from Breitbart, Seema Mehta from the LA Times, State Senator Holly Mitchell. They're coming up next.
One of those paths cannot be using the police to sweep people off of the streets, to warehouse people out of sight and out of mind.
That's how Beto O'Rourke answered my question about the Trump administration's plans to deal with homelessness in California. Let's talk about that and more with our panel. Holly Mitchell is here for the first time. She's a state senator representing much of LA County. She's the chair of the Budget Committee and running for a seat on the LA County Board of Supervisors. Seema Mehta, one of the top political reporters for the Los Angeles Times. She's recently been traveling the country with the presidential candidate, spending a lot of time in Iowa and New Hampshire. Joel Pollack is a writer for Breitbart News who's also been traveling the country covering the presidential campaign. Here's Joel on Fox News with Sean Hannity. Joel hosts Breitbart News tonight on Sirius XM 125 weeknights from 6 to 9 p.m. Pacific. Welcome all. Good to have you here. We just heard from Dr. Carson on homelessness. You, as somebody who works on this issue from the state perspective, what's your reaction to what you just heard?
Well, I would love, as a state legislator, for the federal government to come in and be a true partner. So come on, federal government, help us out.
He said no to 50,000 vouchers for affordable housing, something the governor is asking for.
And that's unfortunate, because I think what's really clear is we can't build our way out of this moral dilemma fast enough. And so creating opportunities of existing housing stock, helping people stay where they are, should be a part of our overall comprehensive solution.
Joel, what's the federal government's role in all of this?
Well, there are laws that allow the federal government to intervene if there's an emergency. And in fact, the Stafford Act of 1988 allows the president to override the governor. And you could see FEMA come in and start treating parts of LA as a disaster area. And if there really were an epidemic, and some people are warning that there could be, we had a typhus outbreak last year, there could be bubonic plague, which is endemic to parts of Southern California. So there are concerns about public health.
In terms of the presidential campaign, though, I think it's also interesting to think of this in terms of what the president says on the stump when he's reaching out to his base, which is he likes to paint liberal cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, Baltimore, cities that are led by Democratic leaders as, you know, that this is the example of Democratic policies, and this is why you should support me.
It was interesting that he said San Diego is doing great on this, who has a Republican mayor who supports him, and he says LA and San Francisco are a disaster. Said that in the same sentence this week while in California. Meanwhile, another big issue is that of guns. Of course, we saw this week Beto O'Rourke talking about his plan, which essentially would be a mandatory gun buyback plan. Joel, as somebody who's been a supporter of the Second Amendment, what goes through your mind when you hear Beto?
Good luck with that. First of all, I've got the Second Amendment, which will probably prevent most of what he's trying to do. And secondly, nobody knows exactly how many AR-15s there are, but it's somewhere between 5 million and 10 million in the country. He's not going to be able to buy those back. We've seen voluntary buybacks fail, mandatory buybacks. I mean, Beto said he doesn't want the police going and rounding up homeless people, but he does want police going into people's homes and taking their guns away and arresting them if they don't comply. It doesn't really work. It's not going to work in this country.
Of course, California has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. Is this something that we should try out here?
I don't know what the numbers are in terms of how many of those kinds of weapons are in California. We're having a hard enough time empowering the Department of Justice to go reclaim guns from people who we already know shouldn't have them. Yeah. And so it really is a cost factor. And I think, offering buyback won't get to the core culture of why we are such a gun-focused society. I don't know that those people who buy those kinds of firearms are going to be inclined just to get some money to turn them in. I just don't think so.
Yeah. All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Coming up next, or as we head to break, to mark the passing of Rick Ocasek this week of the Cars, we're playing one of their biggest hits, Shake It Up. A reminder that this show and all of our past shows available in podcast form. There's a lot of digital-only extended interviews. Just search for The Issue Is wherever you stream. And next week on our show, Republican presidential candidate Mark Sanford will be in studio, as will former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura and the Prime Minister of Armenia in an exclusive interview. There is a combo of people you will only see on just one station. Up next, this combo with some insights from their campaign travels. Be right back.
That's why I am committed to passing a Green New Deal, creating clean jobs, and finally putting an end to fracking once and for all.
Mama La Kamala just don't give a frack.
Kamala Harris becomes the first woman to ever slow jam the news on The Tonight Show this week. She's not the only candidate with late-night feelings this week. Senator Elizabeth Warren visiting Stephen Colbert on The Late Show in New York. Senator Cory Booker on Jimmy Kimmel's couch in Hollywood. And speaking of California, here's a look at a new Emerson poll of California voters. Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders tied in first, Elizabeth Warren in third. But the surprise of this poll, the rise of Andrew Yang and the fall of Kamala Harris. Yang in fourth place, ahead of Harris and ahead of Pete Buttigieg, who is in, or Beto O'Rourke there, who is in fifth place. Let's talk about that and more with our panel, Holly Mitchell, Joel Pollack, Seema Mehta. Seema, let's start with you. You've been out on the road. Where do you see the state of this race?
I mean, this is one poll, but I think this poll does show, this is still fluid. It's still very early, and we have this established top tier, which is, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and then you have this grouping of other people who are trying to move into that tier. The Andrew Yang finding, who knows if, he definitely has a little bit of momentum. You see this in other polls. Who knows if he's actually surpassed Kamala Harris? But when you go to his events, his followers are super loyal. They're rabid. They're very tech savvy. They're online, and his message is appealing to an interesting sort of broad group of people, whether it's former Trump backers or former Bernie backers.
It's really different depending on where you go, and I think one of the things that could happen, of course, we're still several months out, but one of the things that could happen is you see a split among all the early primary states. Elizabeth Warren is surging right now in Iowa. Bernie Sanders won New Hampshire in 2016, and he's on top in some polls there. Joe Biden has a lock almost on South Carolina. It's very hard to see it going differently. I was down there, and he's got a lot of support, institutional support from the African-American community, churches, unions. And then Nevada, before California votes on Super Tuesday. Nevada, right now, Biden is leading there. Warren's creeping up, but Kamala Harris has been there many times. I've traveled with her a little bit there, and she could make a play there to try to bring back that top-tier status she had a few weeks ago.
Senator, you're an endorser of Kamala Harris. She's somebody you've worked with, somebody you're friends with. Are you concerned, though, that it seems like she's really slipped behind in a lot of these polls, and to see her behind Andrew Yang, somebody who's never even run for office before?
Not at all, because it's so early. And I think every time the American people have an opportunity to see the interaction between the candidates, get exposed to the candidates, the polls adjust pretty significantly.
So around the horn, who do you think is going to be the Democratic nominee?
Kamala Harris.
I'm not making predictions.
Smart.
I'm going to stick with my original prediction and also say Kamala Harris. It's still early, but I think that she checks a lot of boxes, and also there isn't a single constituency within the Democratic Party that has a serious problem with her.
Last question has nothing to do with politics, but it's something I find interesting. Emmys this weekend on Fox. Who's going to win the Emmy for Best Drama?
Pose.
I'm going to go Game of Thrones, even though I was not a huge fan of the way that it ended.
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, well, Game of Thrones, the most nominations ever, 32 nominations. Game of Thrones has a lock, even though the last season wasn't that great. Hear that music? You can only see the Emmys on one station. That's this station. I'll see you from the purple carpet this weekend. And don't forget what Cersei said on Game of Thrones. When you play a Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Thanks for watching The Issue Is. Let's hope we all survive this weekend. See you later.